Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I request that you try and come to the front and in the middle so the audience can also focus, the speakers can also focus on you. So welcome to our session called Peace Under Pressure, Navigating Conflict, Environment and Population Health. And I think that this is a tremendous opportunity to talk about the intersections of conflict, climate change, and peace. We will have two sets of panels. The first set that I will moderate is called Climate Change as a Threat Multiplier, Implications for Conflict, Health, and Governance. And we will then hand over to Sarah, who will take on the second set of panelists, which she will introduce later. So we're going to have an exciting session today. Most importantly, we want it to be interactive. So we're going to put up a Slido, a QR code, if you don't mind just clicking on it. And you can ask any questions as we go along. But not only that, you can also like the question, and therefore we know how important it is to all of you. So without further ado, let me first of all say that when we talk about climate change, we often speak in terms of temperatures, emissions, and targets. But in reality, climate change is not just an environmental crisis. It's increasingly a human security crisis. It shapes where people can live, how communities survive, whether health systems can function, and ultimately whether societies remain stable or slide into fragility. Over the past decade, we've seen how droughts, floods, food insecurity, and environmental degradation intersect with political and social tensions, amplifying displacement, disrupting livelihoods, and placing enormous strain on already fragile institutions and health systems. And very often, the communities least responsible for climate change are the ones bearing the heaviest costs. So, it became very clear then that the climate change is not something we can treat separately from peace, governance, and health. And these systems are deeply interconnected. When one breaks down, the others soon follow. But there's also another side to the story. When we invest in resilient health systems, inclusive governance, and community-led solutions, we don't just respond to crises. We reduce the risk of conflict itself, and we create spaces for cooperation, trust, and shared problem solving. Planetary health in this sense is not just about protecting ecosystems, it's about safeguarding social stability and human well-being. So this is going to be our conversation this afternoon. So without further ado, let me first of all introduce our first keynote speaker. He will be, I hope he's online, Professor Wallenstein. Peter Wallenstein, are you there? He's a professor.
I'm here.
Wonderful. He's a professor emeritus at Uppsala University and the University of Notre Dame, USA. He has a very, very distinguished career. He was the first head of the Department of Peace and Conflict Research, and he's also initiated and led the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and the first holder of the Dag Hammarskjöld Chair at Uppsala University. His CV is so rich, but just to say that he has personal experience as a third-party mediator in armed conflicts around the world. And the volume, Peter Wallenstein, a pioneer in making peace researchable, explains his involvement in peace research and presents 10 fields he has contributed to. And I think he has written widely on peace and conflict resolution. If you Google, you'll find them all. But most importantly, we are so delighted to have you here, Professor Peter Wallenstein. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you, and in many ways I wish I was with you, because last night we had -11 here in Uppsala centigrades, but this is where we are. So as you just mentioned, my job is to deal with peace research, but I'm grateful for this invitation to talk more in the line of cross-cutting links. And I will particularly focus on the links between conflicts and peace in that narrow sense, and its connections to health, but also to some extent to gender. So I will do it from my PowerPoint presentation. So we go to the next picture. And this is the one I'll ask you to remember for my talk. This is something we have done exactly at what you mentioned, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. And this just records the number of armed conflicts going on every year since 1946. So armed conflicts here is basically defined as smaller or larger wars. There could be civil wars, there could be wars of liberation, but also interstate wars. And what this picture shows us, which is important for our discussion, is the variation. We start in 1946, what is defined as the end of the Second World War, or the beginning of the post-war period, which is of course not a correct term. It's not the post-war period. There has been a lot of armed conflicts. But what you see from a level less than about 20 armed conflicts going on in 1946, it gradually increases to a peak around 1990 with a little more than 50 armed conflicts. And you can say this reflects very much all the tensions in what we call the Cold War, which obviously was not cold, except in Europe, where the borders were frozen. But the antagonists in the Cold War were heavily involved in armed conflicts elsewhere. Then you see, which I think is the most dramatic in this whole graph, is a reduction in armed conflicts from about 1990 going on until about 2010, 2011 somewhere, which is going down from the number of 50, approaching around 30. And then we see another shift. You can almost date it to 2014, when the number of armed conflicts start to shoot up again. And you will remember that that's the first Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it's also the activities of the Islamic State around in various places. And then we have arrived at a gradual increase up to a much higher number than we saw at the end of the Cold War, with the 61 recorded in 2024, and the data for 2025 is still not ready, but it's likely to be in the same vicinity. So that's the image I like you to have in mind, these variations, but also that we are in a very particular juncture today. So let's go to the next picture. And it will show you the number of people who have died in these conflicts, fatalities in what is known here as technically called state-based conflicts, which are basically wars involving the state versus another state or state versus a non-state actor. And what you have here is a shorter span, 1989 to 2024, and the number of people being killed is not necessarily the same as the number of armed conflicts. Of course, one armed conflict can be extremely deadly. And so here you find a more varied pattern with some peaks. And during the 2010s, in particular, you have the war in Syria. You have another peak around 2022, 2023, not a long time ago, which includes the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, but also not very much discussed war in Ethiopia, in Tigray. So, and again, you can see there is a sort of a trend of increasing violence. Now, this is a little the background that we have when we are thinking about armed conflicts and peace. Let me now go to your general area, health. So let's look at the next picture. And it shows a steady improvement of health conditions. I wanted to have as long a record as possible, And of course, Sweden, my own country, has a remarkable record since the 1750s on population numbers. So what you see here is infant mortality in Sweden, boys and girls, from 1751 to 2024. And it's hard to find a longer record. And you see this a bit rugged image in the beginning, but then it gradually straightens out. And it's a really remarkable indication of health improvement. And it's also something happening in the rest of the world. This is really the incredible medical achievements, simple things as well as more complicated matters, that makes it possible for infants to survive. And then we come down to the levels where we are today. And of course, today we face a new challenge. Many people report that the infant mortality is again increasing with the reduction of international aid, and that would particularly hit Africa. But the long-term picture is still this one, that the world has seen a real good improvement. And I think that's important to have in mind, but it also leads us to then discuss the connections between health and peace. And that we will do in the next image. There are a number of obvious connections, of course. What we have seen lately is that medical services are ending up in the middle of armed conflicts, and all the agreements that have been reached before has said that medical services should be protected, but we see that that has not been respected in some of the more recent wars. And that is, of course, very serious. That means war is really bad for anybody's health. There are also psychological long-term impact that I think we haven't really investigated either. The observation of PTSD, for instance, is a phenomenon that you will find on either side in a fighting conflict between different parties, that they will have a shared experience of what that means and how to deal with it. And I think that's just some very quick illustrations of the connections here between war, armed conflicts, and peace. And I would wish really that we had more interdisciplinary cooperation on matters like these. And there is also a particularly understudied field, I think, which would be really the decision makers themselves, those who make the decisions, who organize countries, military professions, etc. How are they really reacting psychologically, medically, in different kind of stress situations that any war contains? We know from other evidence that if you are stressed, it becomes more difficult to digest data or information that is not compatible with your views. That means you are becoming more rigid and more locked in to your own thinking. I think we need to know more about that, and that was of great interest at the time when we discussed nuclear weapons and nuclear crises. That has not been on the forefront in the last 30 years. We had this reduction of armed conflict. But today we are again discussing the dangers of the nuclear arms race. And that brings back this problem of stress during decision making. But there are also some even more fundamental issues. Is there a selection effect of some sort? Who are really getting to become the biggest, strongest power holders, and how are they trained for that, and what is their special characters, if any? And there are even what more anecdotal evidence of the uses of drug in decision making. So there is a lot of connections here between medical sciences and social sciences that I think we should put on the research agenda. Well, when we now talk about this long-term trend that I showed, shouldn't that be something connecting to fewer wars? Yeah, I think so. It would be, particularly for civil wars, for instance, if health facilities are used in a non-discriminatory way, which of course is part of the medical ethics. But we also know that some people have greater chance of getting treatment than others, depending on class, where you live, etc. So indeed, health administered in a non-discriminatory way would really result in fewer conflicts. But there are also some data which says that in the 1800s, for instance, more soldiers died than they do today. Medical services now makes it more possible for people to be repaired, so to say, treated after they have been wounded in a war than there used to be. And in a sense, some people argue that that will result in less inhibitions against starting wars. We can discuss whether that is true or not, but clearly it is true that soldiers today die less in wars than they used to, partly perhaps due to epidemics. Let me move to the next slide and raise the issue here of the gender connection. I would like to just highlight an important study that came out now almost 2.5 years ago, the Lancet Commission on Peaceful Societies through Health Equity and Gender Equality, which looked at some of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, where of course health is one, peace is another. There is also the question of gender equality, where we can see and understand that there are lots of rather significant connections between women's health and the family's education and survival. There is also clearly so that we have seen that societies where women are more represented in decision making, in cabinets or in the workforce or in the parliament, for instance, we see that there are fewer wars of different kinds, there are less violations of human rights. All that raises another interesting issue that is more difficult to discuss, but maybe also should be on the agenda. And it has to do with traditional masculinity, which tend to emphasize strength, muscular strength, tend to be more fascinated by discipline, authority, and war. And for a number of years, we have seen an important discussion about the role of males. But of course, today we can see a trend going in the almost opposite direction, that the decision-making circles are increasingly reserved only for males, as we can see when we look at the US, Russia, and China, for instance. All that provides a set of additional challenges. And of course, there is one body which is supposed to manage this. So let me go to the next slide. And that will give you a quick picture of the role of the United Nations. Here just indicated with the number of resolutions taken in the UN Security Council, covering basically the same period that I showed you before in the number of armed conflicts. And you can see that for many years, which was basically the Cold War years, from 1946 onwards until 1990, there were very few resolutions passed in the Security Council, and you can also see that sometimes the red line tells us the number of draft resolutions that were vetoed, and that in some years in the 50s there were more vetoes than resolutions passed. And then something happens around 1990. The organization starts to become active and relevant, and you see a rise in the number of resolutions, and that also combines very well with what I described before, this reduction in armed conflicts. But from around middle of the 2010s onwards, when we saw this rise in armed conflict, actually we don't see a corresponding rise in activity by the Security Council. It basically suggests that it has been sidelined. So let me go to the next picture, which is actually the same as you saw before, but just to remind you, we see this dramatic increase in armed conflicts from around 2014, but it corresponds then with a lack of increased use of the UN and the Security Council. And that in a sense is a good indication, or perhaps a bad indication, that there is less cooperation among the leading actors in the world, more rivalry, more ways of blocking each other, or at least blocking efforts to provide for new peacekeeping operations, or other measures like sending out mediators or mandating other organizations to do work. So we see a corresponding phenomenon happening at the same time. The number of armed conflicts increase, the UN is more paralyzed, and we can also see the number of peace processes are going down, the number of mediations are going down. And also, political scientists would tell me it combines with the reduction in democratic developments. A number of democracies are succumbed to pressures, and military coups have removed elected leaders, etc. So all that provides for a very bleak picture. I think we should still not give up, and as you can see, my idea is that we could talk about quality peace, learning from these all this data that I've showed you, because we can look at how did these agreements or these conflicts end. Did they end in victories or in agreements? And to some extent, the numbers are quite comparable. It's as common that conflicts end in peace agreements as them ending in victory, which often is a surprise to many who starts a war where they expect a quick victory and they don't get it. But we can also look at these agreements. Do they really provide for the quality that will prevent a return to armed conflicts? And my conclusion from looking at the data and the readings is that it's only when they provide dignity and respect for all inhabitants, and they provide security for all inhabitants, that's when we have the conditions that will give a peace with some quality, a peace that people can invest in. But that also means that it has to be a predictability, that these are the conditions that will last. So if we then go to the next slide, we can start to think about historical developments and see that the world has, so to say, shifted between two strands of dominant thinking. I call them universalist and particularist. Universalist policies are really when we can see that the major powers try really to organize their relations through mutually acceptable rules of behavior and try to develop general standards. Whereas particularist policies is when big powers are emphasizing their special interest, and without regard really for what happens to existing organizations or norms, so to say. And with that, we can come back to the next slide, which will then show you on the next picture the same that we saw before, the importance of the health improvement. But here in gray, I have included those areas where there are this more particularist thinking that historians have been identifying from various junctures in the world. And even though health conditions and so on has improved, we see that the world has still slipped back into the more particularist way of thinking that we can see occurring. It's not at irregular intervals, but there are shifts and changes in major power conditions that are important for us to observe. And we can say that we are now in one of these particularist periods. So let me finish by drawing some conclusions on the final slide from this. What are the lessons we can learn from this? And you can see it on this next slide. I think with methodology, we can learn a lot from history. And some of the conclusions I draw is the one I mentioned, that wars often end with negotiations. I can also say we have data showing that such settlements with negotiations are better both for democracy and health provisions. The idea that with power we can push others to do what we want them to do does not provide for a lasting peace. And the kind of periods we are into right now, particularist periods, they lead to more dangerous confrontations. But we can also say we can learn from this and then develop into the future a wiser form of universalism that incorporates the kind of lessons I just mentioned. So thus, if we are in a rather bleak period of time right now, I would say yes, with some thinking, with some good research, with some good discussions, we can develop strategies to make sure that the future will be a brighter one and correspond to all the hopes we can have and all the lessons we have from the improvement of health. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Wallenstein. I'd like to invite all the panelists for the session up to the stage so that we don't waste time. And while they're coming up, just to introduce Professor Tobias Eide. He's a leading peace and conflict researcher whose work focuses on the links between climate change, environmental stress, and conflict from the Peace Research Institute of Frankfurt, and Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at Technical University of Darmstadt. We have David McLachlan-Carr. He's a very senior United Nations development official, more than 30 years of experience, much of it also in conflict settings, and is currently the Regional Director for Asia Pacific for the UN Development Coordination Office. And last but not least, we have Shweta Narayan, who is the campaign lead at Global Climate and Health Alliance. And she will bring a very fresh perspective on how communications, other industries can actually lead to conflict. So, oops, I'm going to try and sit down. Okay. Let me start with you, Tobias. We're running quite short of time. Your research, right, sits at the intersection of climate science and peace research. But from the evidence so far, how exactly does climate change act as a threat multiplier for conflict? And where do we sometimes oversimplify the relationship in policy discussions?
All right, thanks a lot for the question. So the link between climate change and conflict is indeed often simplified among both policymakers and academics. Sometimes there is this idea that climate change just occurs and conflict is about to follow. And what's actually more true is that climate change acts as a threat multiplier in the sense that if we have countries that are already at the brink of large-scale protest, of rioting, of civil wars, of communal violence, and that are highly vulnerable to climate change, that in these specific countries, climate change can add to existing political or economic pressures and can increase the risk of conflict. If you think of a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, for instance, climate change can do, or Somalia, climate change can do a lot of damage there. If you think of Sweden, for instance, where the risk of conflict is close to zero, even a huge multiplier will not have many impacts on risks. And so the underlying baseline is that even though climate change can multiply conflict risks, conflict are always essentially about political and economic factors. Moving on to the second part of the question, how can climate change impact conflict risks? And there's two main pathways, and I'm not going to expand them in all details, but very roughly speaking, there's the grievances pathway and there's the opportunity pathway. Especially when it comes to low intensity conflicts, protests, riots, lack of social cohesion in communities, grievances matter a lot. That basically means that climate change leads to droughts, food prices are going up, people protest against it. There's water scarcity, there's insufficient response to floods or storms. If you think about the more high-intensity conflicts, there's actually way more evidence for the opportunity pathway. That basically means climate change weakens states, it provides benefits to rebel groups, and these opportunities lead to a higher risk of armed conflict. A very easy example is if you are a farmer in whatever conflict-affected country there is, you have a very healthy farm, everything goes well, someone from the nearby militia or rebel group will ask you to join the group. You're not going to do it because, well, you can provide for yourself, you're happy. Joining the armed group would be very dangerous. You have a high risk of ending up in prison or being killed. Yeah. Now, 2-3 years of drought, of storm, you lose all your income, can no longer send your kids to school. Same rebel group, same militia is approaching you, asking whether you want to fight for them for money. All of a sudden, it's much more likely that you're going to join them. Not all these climate victims will join armed groups, but the opportunity costs of doing so are all of a sudden much lower. And health can also factor in here. In fact, we already have pretty robust statistical evidence that in some areas that suffer from certain diseases being more prevalent, such as malaria or others that are tied to climate change, we have a higher risk of armed conflict because the state has a harder time penetrating it. There's more problems for the state to gain legitimacy and support amongst its people. So there's also a climate health conflict nexus that we should worry about.
Really important points, and I'm really glad that you brought it down to community level, which I will come back to with Shweta later. Now, David, you've coordinated UN responses across development, humanitarian, peace building, and just before the session started, we were talking about the very interesting situation in Venezuela, where you were, resident coordinator for 5 years. Where do you currently see the strongest links and the biggest disconnects between climate action, peace building, and development within global and regional governance systems?
Thank you very much, Jamila, and good afternoon to everybody. And thanks for giving this stuffy UN bureaucrat an opportunity to perhaps talk a little bit about through the multilateral lens. But it was interesting to also listen to Professor Wallenstein talking about the atrophy in the Security Council. And how less effective the UN has been in peacekeeping, certainly in the last 2 decades, if not 3. And I think the pivot of our UN work has really moved towards conflict prevention, looking at climate peace in particular and its effects on social outcomes through humanitarian development work. So less political, perhaps more humanitarian development, which is very true, and I think it's borne out in the statistics. I'd like to refer quickly to 3 very important years in 2023, 24, 25. 2023, the Secretary General declared the triple planetary crisis, which I think everybody's aware of, the nexus between climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, and the impacts that's having on human outcomes. But also the Secretary General was talking about, that global peace is threatened essentially by really natural phenomena, which are unnatural at the same time, but that half of humanity is at the front line of climate-driven displacement, democratic backsliding, contested geographies, rising inequalities, and then there's global pandemics and, of course, food insecurity, which is increasing across the planet. So in this region, we see it everywhere, and the Pacific you've referred to several times. It's probably no more profound than in the Pacific to see the impacts that are happening. So I think, we are at a crossroads. And I think the 20th century, if it was defined by trying to prevent interstate war, the 21st century will be about building resilience against systemic interlocking risks, which is where we're going. So this requires, I think, 3 shifts: from reaction to prevention, investing upstream in climate resilience, gender equality, and universal health coverage; from silos to systems. We are horribly siloed, but breaking down the artificial boundaries between sectors, particularly humanitarian development and peace building, but also between health, environment, and governance, and treating them as one. And then from exclusion to inclusion, embedding the voices and leadership of youth and women and the socially disadvantaged and the vulnerable in every stage of policy design and implementation. So this is the new trend. The Secretary General calls it his UN 80 reform program. It's very much in action at the moment. But the SDG Summit really talked about the need to work on these vulnerabilities and to increase preventative diplomacy by using the lens of what's called, jargonistically, I'm afraid, the quintet of change, which means to use foresight, behavioral science, innovation, data as the foundation for UN work to make societies more secure. So what does it look like for the multilateral system, essentially? At the Summit of the Future last year, the Secretary General said we need to invest in future generations. We need to be forward-looking. We need to leverage artificial intelligence and digital transformation to improve development outcomes across the planet. No more so than in health. And India's doing this extremely well by using digitalization to reach all population in healthcare. So, for us, it's essentially the UN 80 reform, which I've just alluded to, is the UN, which has grown exponentially over 8 years. More than 54 agencies, funds, and programs and specialized agencies, needs to review its mandates, needs to come back into a much more coherent whole and focus on our core work: humanitarian development, peace building, but not creating silos between the three, but creating them as one sort of synergistic level of work across what we're doing. So very quickly, we're seeing amalgamations happening right now at headquarters level. In the region, here in Bangkok, where I'm the regional director for DCO, we are creating what's called a regional collaborative platform to bring the agencies, funds, and programs in health, in climate work together around common themes so that we can leverage the mandates of the UN to deliver better outcomes. And 2 good examples. One is our one on energy transition and climate change, which is led by UN Disaster Risk Reduction, the UN Environment Programme, and the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Those 3 come together to ensure that UN work is much more focused on improving these outcomes to mitigate climate change and support societies. We have another one which is on resilience, which is to make societies more capable of weathering crises, whether they be natural or man-made. And that's led by UNDP and UNICEF, and it's working very well together. And finally, a great one on gender and human rights, which is, of course, the promotion of our really core gender work and our work led by OHCHR and UNFPA. But this all sounds very good, but ODA is declining dramatically. We've never been in such a situation, I think, in 2025, of seeing 20% cut in ODA globally. It has absolutely devastated some of the agency funds and programs who are really struggling to continue their work. But I think we're looking for more investments. The Human Security Trust Fund is an extremely powerful tool that's been set up since 1999, recognising that we need to have a core fund which can actually support these human security activities at country level. It's capitalised, undercapitalised, if I may, dramatically, and we're certainly encouraging with the transition from the SDGs to whatever happens in 2030, that the Human Security Trust Fund will become one of our primary funding mechanisms for the UN system, so that we can have catalytic financing for improving outcomes in health and development and of course climate, in the climate space. But I'll leave it there, Jamila.
Yeah. I think you covered a lot of ground there on looking at how do you break the silos in the UN itself. And in a way, the defunding of the UN has created pressure as well on consolidation. But do you really see the need for that reform is clear, but don't we require a little bit of reimagination of how multilateral systems should now work?
Yeah, I agree. And if your question is, are we too siloed? Absolutely. UN bureaucrats are very good at creating ivory towers, and you're very comfortable in your little area. But the nexus between, I hate the overused word nexus, but the link between humanitarian and development, the silo needs to be broken down, because you can't have sustainable development outcomes or humanitarian interventions unless there is a sustainable development follow-on. And similarly with peace building. So I think the core of UN work is shifting from those silos towards a much more holistic approach through what I represent essentially as the resident coordinator system, which is to have one representative of the Secretary General at the country level who leads country teams to ensure that our outcomes basically are not siloed, but basically cover the national priorities for humanitarian and development and peace building, and making sure that we can leverage all of the UN agencies' mandates to maximum purpose at the country level. It's a struggle because people are comfortable in their spaces. It requires, but I think, actually the ODA crisis, the financing crunch is actually going to force a lot of the reforms, which I think are absolutely necessary.
Absolutely. I think at the end of the day, it's about money, isn't it? How do you finance a system? Correct. And it has to be lean now. I just want to move to Shweta now. Tobias put a spotlight on how important it is to look at conflict also from a community level. And, and conflicts often framed as the inevitable outcome of climate stress, drought, scarcity, migration, population pressure, and so forth. But your work challenges that framing. How does climate and energy disinformation, and there's also a question I'm going to combine in here, on how climate solutions like renewables can be a peace multiplier, but also how climate and energy disinformation actively manufactures consent for instability by shifting blame onto communities and climate impacts.
Thank you, Dr. Jamila. And yes, and I'll come to the question because it's really an important one. But just quickly on disinformation as how it actively creates an environment of instability and conflict. And it's a very useful starting point to understand climate as a threat multiplier in context of conflict. And Tobias, what you said, that there has to be, along with climate stress, the political and economic instability advances that. I actually want to take it a notch further. I would say the intentional political and economic choices further the climate stress and create a situation of conflict. And those choices, those political and economic choices, are shaped very actively, as we see in climate space, by fossil fuel industries' disinformation. So these are not circumstances that emerged out of its own organically. These are very well-intentioned agenda of the fossil fuel industry to deflect attention from responsibility, from structural problems to communities who have often not contributed to the problem or who are the worst affected and have least resource to challenge the problem. And how climate disinformation creates that space for harm. There are three dangerous sort of pathways. The first one is that climate disinformation seeks to depoliticize harm. So you will hear a lot of narrative of the drought was inevitable, once in 100-time floods, when the science is very clear, but the disinformation has made science unacceptable, questionable, there is delays. And what it has done is also put the blame on the event rather than the structural, systemic problems as a result, which has led to the consequence. So, I mean, for example, in Africa, we see a lot of narratives of climate-induced farmer-herder conflict. What we don't see are land grabs, extractivist economy, arms flow, the failure of governance in state. And disinformation, climate disinformation very clearly tries to shift that responsibility and accountability and blames the people who are struggling to survive. So that's depoliticization is very, critical. The second way in which climate disinformation harms is it actually dehumanizes people. People who need to be protected are seen as villains in the story. And the most popular one is in the case of migration. Now, who wants to leave their homes? But people are forced to leave their homes because of climate crisis, because their homes are being taken away by the seas, or the situation is so unsurvivable that they have to move. But how do the disinformation narrative manufacture or present those people? Aliens, illegal people, criminals. And that creates a situation where risk is converted into conflict. The xenophobic attacks that we see on migrant workforce, they are made the villain. They have the least, they have not caused this crisis. But it's a very intentional, again, way of dehumanizing people so that you can then bring militarized solutions. And we are seeing that across with militarized borders, shrinking of civil society spaces. And what it does, the investment is in furthering the harm rather than investment, as Dr. Mila, you said, on efforts that will build peace, like stronger health systems, resilient cities, adaptation investments. So it takes away that investment, and disinformation shapes the way governments react, shapes the way in which people in power react without any accountability. And the third very critical thing, I think, which is foundational in both peace building and public health, is trust. Climate disinformation erodes that trust. And when the trust in the system is gone, then it's very hard to bring people together, bring communities together. And the biggest form of climate disinformation, and I mean, I find personally horrific, which we are seeing now in Canada. So, I mean, I also want to challenge a little bit of your Sweden versus a vulnerable country like DRC example, because with disinformation we are seeing people are losing trust in the system. So there are cases where colleagues from an organization called Canadian Associations for Physicians for Environment are seeing that in cases of wildfire, for example, it's a matter of life and death. You need to, if your forests and your homes are on fire, you need to leave. People have stopped believing evacuation notices because of disinformation. People have stopped believing rescuers' orders for evacuation and have lost their lives. So disinformation is, of course, it thrives in much more vulnerable situation much faster, but it's universal, it's intentional, and it is very, very clear move. And this is not new. Climate disinformation by fossil fuel industry follows the same playbook as the tobacco disinformation years before the bans came into place. The denial, the delay, the normalization, this is the way it is. It all leads to risk converting into conflicts.
I think you put a lens on, how disinformation, which nobody thinks about, can actually be also a push factor for instability and also conflict and misunderstanding within communities. We're seeing quite a number of questions on the board, on the Slido. And the first one, maybe Tobias, you might want to take that if you're comfortable. To what extent can universal health coverage and resilient primary care systems mitigate climate-related instability, and where do they fail?
That's an excellent question. And it's a very tough question because most conflicts, including the one that we can link to climate change, have, as you spelled out, political and economic roots behind them. So even if we extend universal health coverage, primary care, we might not be able to mitigate or prevent all of those conflicts simply because some warlords, some politicians decide this is the way they want to go. Where I see an opportunity, however, is that, especially in situations related to climate disasters, what we know from a vast body of research is that when disaster strikes, earthquakes, but also climate-related ones, storms and floods, if people have the impression that states and authorities can help them, and can help them includes, not only, but also includes providing care, evacuating them, getting to the hospital in time, giving them good care, helping them to recover from whatever injuries they suffered from. If people have that impression, their trust both in the community they live in and in state authority increases. Conversely, if they have the impression the state doesn't care about them or the state prioritizes certain economic groups, certain ethnic groups, certain political groups, their trust both in their fellow community members but also in state authorities decreases, and obviously that is a conflict driver. So I would say disaster-related care, preventing disasters, preparing for disasters, but also extending health coverage to help people recover, that would be a really good entry point if you were to play it from an instability perspective.
Yeah. Really good response there. Maybe to Shweta, you talked a little bit about fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel industry can turn around and say, well, actually, we're anchors of stability. We provide jobs, energy security, even peace in fragile contexts. This is what they say, right? Communities on the front line obviously tell a different story, and you had a fantastic report called Cradle to Grave. And the question, well, maybe, tell us what this distortion of narrative looks like and why, and also answer the second question on the Slido, that evidence that climate solutions like renewables can actually be a peace multiplier, democratizing access to energy. Shouldn't this be a focus for peace building? And maybe give us some examples, Shweta, where you've seen this.
So yeah, I mean, absolutely, and we often see that especially during climate negotiations and in general, an impression that fossil fuel industries like to present themselves of solutions and providing energy security, development narrative. But the reality, and Dr. Jamila, you referenced to this report, it took us about almost over a year to compile a report which we call as Cradle to Grave, the health harms of fossil fuels and the imperative for a just transition, where we looked at three, actually, it's some colleagues called it the Bible of bad news, but it's important to know what the bad news is in order to act. We looked at the entire industrial life cycle of the fossil fuel production, from extraction, exploration, production, consumption, disposal, and post-disposal. And we looked at the harm, and then we mapped the harms at every stage that the industry produces. A lot of people are very familiar with air pollution as one of the forms of harms, but the data is intense in terms of at every stage of life cycle, industrial life cycle. We also looked at every stage of human life cycle and how those harms correspond into human impacts, and then the full body. But what interestingly, and that's where I think your question comes in terms of narratives, we looked at the social behavior of the fossil fuel industry, how they operate. And we found very clear examples of harms that are very tangible health harms. So conflicts, this forceful displacement of indigenous population, land grabs, exploiting weak governance mechanism, colluding with arms groups, supplying of arms, colluding with police to oppress land defenders. I mean, we often see this report comes out that land defenders, environmental defenders are among the most vulnerable groups of people because they're often targeted. They are, in many cases, they're murdered by industry and corporate interests. We saw a very systematic documentation of human rights violations that fossil fuel industries have engaged in. And examples are plenty. Most common one, I would say, are from Nigeria, where indigenous people from the Ogoni land were murdered because of the fossil fuel industry's interest. We're seeing a similar kind of example play out as we speak in Mozambique, with fossil fuel corporations burning down villages to grab that land for gas infrastructure. So we see that kind of conflict-like situation, or even much worse, systemic kind of situation where fossil fuel industries have played a role in creating the harms that they are often seen saying that we are on the side of prevention, right? Also, just one more part is that, like, a lot of that narrative is also framed by the presence of the industry itself in many places that they should not be. I strongly believe that fossil fuel industries have no role in the climate negotiations. You cannot sit and negotiate with people who are causing the crisis. As simple as that. But they position themselves through PR, through communications, through lobbyists as, they have to be part of the solution. Coming to the question about renewable, and I 100% agree. I think renewables are the way in which we can democratize energy access. We can provide energy security to people who need energy. But I have one word of caution. I think it will be a missed opportunity, or actually it will not work. The idea of renewable as peace building mechanism will not work if we don't change the systemic way in which renewables are seen. There is a structural problem with fossil fuels, right? There is top-down concentrated power. People's voices are not considered. It's decided that's the way. If we just replace fossil fuels with renewable without looking at the structural problems, without keep bringing people into the conversation, indigenous people, acknowledging and respecting land rights, free and prior informed consent mechanisms, local participation, community leadership, we are actually replicating the forms of harm with dirty energy or clean energy.
Yeah.
So I think along with renewables, the principles that we have ignored or set aside and the mechanisms that we have normalized should need to also be changed. And then you will have lasting peace and justice.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We don't want renewable energy to go down the same route as the fossil fuel industry. David, there are questions on the UN, how it's progressing in humanitarian development, peace-building interventions, and basically talking about the siloed approach. I think you already dealt with that. But really, realistically, how much is it progressing?
Well, you're asking a bureaucrat here, so I have to defend my organization. Look, how much is the UN progressing in humanitarian development, peace-building interventions? I think it's for the public to judge, but there is no doubt that this Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who is in his legacy year, he will leave, of course, has left his imprimatur on what he wants to see as a leaner, meaner, more efficient UN system. And I must admit, I think, as I mentioned earlier, 80 years of growth and fragmentation has not helped the clarity of the mandate that the UN needs to prosecute. I think, look, a good example is in leadership. The job I had before I came to Bangkok was the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General, Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, it's a mouthful, but the idea and the logic is that in one leadership, you combine peace building as the Deputy Special Representative, the resident coordinator for development and the humanitarian coordinator in one person. It's a horrible job, if I can be very frank. But nonetheless, it's absolutely necessary if you're going to ensure that there's coherence across these three streams. Humanitarian interventions being backed up by early recovery and development and resilience leading to peace dividends is a necessary continuum that I think we need to stress. And the way you do it is essentially through more empowered leaders who have more authority over the agencies in order to deliver on collective outcomes. The other innovation that's happened in the UN system in the last since this Secretary General is the institution of what's called the Cooperation Framework, which is essentially the roadmap for UN intervention in the country at the country level. It's nationally owned. It's signed with the host government. So if we were in Fiji, for example, it's based on collective and agreed outcomes for development and support. They are usually around energy transition, about climate mitigation, mitigating sea level rise, but food insecurity, dealing with health outcomes, essentially, in one document, which is a 5-year framework, which assigns tasks to each of the UN agencies, funds and programs to deliver on that promise to the government. And it's backed up by a rigorous monitoring and evaluation and annual results reporting. This is how you do it, I think. Well, that's how bureaucrats do it, which is slowly and incrementally rather than putting a bomb under it, which is probably what it needs. But it is, I think, progressing to greater coherence. And I think the financial imperative is going to really drive it. But I think also, government's getting tired of that fragmentation and duplication and competition for resources across agencies, funds and programs. They need to come together and need to deliver together and leverage their very valuable mandates.
Great. There was a good question that suddenly has disappeared, but I do remember it. There was a question about, how does mitigation play a role? Give us some hope, where has it happened? I think, Tobias, maybe we start with you, because you've written about environmental peace building, where shared environmental challenges actually foster cooperation rather than violence. Maybe share some examples, give us some hope, where resource or climate governance has reduced tensions.
I think what really gives me hope in these admittedly very difficult times is the resilience and ingenuity of local communities using both traditional knowledge but also new technologies. And you will find in any conference, you will see there's climate change, there's transnational corporations, there's undemocratic governments, there's health crisis, and this is going to lead to war, migration, poor outcomes whatsoever. And if you look on the ground, there's an amazing number of local communities who defy the odds, who resist these pressures, and who increase their quality of life and increase peace at the local level. And I mean, you mentioned Nigeria, the farmer herders. You could bring similar examples from Kenya, from Somalia, from other countries in the Sahel zone in Africa. And if you look there in a quite significant number of cases, what actually happens is during a drought, these groups which have been fighting for political reasons, for land, for traditional revenge reasons, set aside their difference and say, there's a really big drought going on. If we now fight over this water source, no one can access it. Both of our herds are going to die. What we need to do is the elders need to come together, forge a peace agreement, discuss at least for the period of the drought. So they defy the odds of political instability, government absence, climate change, drought, poverty, and so on. And they forge an agreement that helps their communities to come through the droughts with their animals, their food source, and their health and their water sources still somewhat intact. Sometimes after that, we see the conflict re-emerging, but sometimes people use these drought-fostered or drought-forged institutions to work with each other and to build more lasting relations. And we find similar success stories of local level cooperation around the environment leading to more peaceful outcomes all around the world. And I think that's what gives me hope for the years to come.
Wonderful. Now, we are running very short of time right now, but I'm going to take on that question about elected politicians, right? Shweta, how do we inform and positively influence the public ahead of elections? What are some effective tactics as a campaigner?
Well, I mean, I have a whole toolkit for that. But I think most effective tactic, especially in engagement with politicians, are public accountability. Demanding public accountability cannot help them escape their responsibility, and that spotlighting, especially around elections, we've seen, I mean, in fact, there's a joke in India. So our election cycles run for 5 years. Most of the important work, public work, happens on the 4th year because people are fed up waiting for 3 years. They raise their voice. They get all their roads constructed and public infrastructure in the 4th and the 5th year, because that's the time when politicians will come back seeking vote. So just making sure that it's not the 4th year, but throughout their in their public office, putting the spotlight on them and asking the tough questions. I mean, that's why they are our representatives out there. So asking the tough questions and making sure that they don't get the shroud of invisibility is very important. That's like one single thing I would say. We have to ask the tough questions.
And I think you need to look at Shweta's toolkit. I think with the mobile phone, social media, information is more widely spread, demanding accountability is higher, but disinformation is also higher. So we need to, how do you manage that very tricky, line? We only got 3 minutes left. The question on Somalia mission, I think, David, you just have to talk to the resident coordinator in Somalia to reuse renewable energies. I think there's nothing that we can say here. But the question on burdening local communities to come up with solutions to fix problems, is it extractive and exploitative? Maybe, David, you mentioned about local communities. Maybe you want to take that? Sorry, it's not you, David. Sorry. Tobias, yeah.
I would say, is it sustainable or just to portray local communities as helpless victims and as incapable, and thereby discounting their knowledge and their agency? I would say that is not sustainable and just either. Yeah. Doesn't mean we don't need to fix the problems at a global level. We need to do, but we also shouldn't discount the local.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I just wanted to say this, that I don't think the expectation is for local communities to come up with solutions to the problem that others and the structure has created. But there is a voice, there is a role, and we discount on it. We never bring the communities at the table where decisions are being made, and that's not burning, that's our responsibility.
Absolutely. So to wrap up, do you want to say something, David?
Yeah, just this Somalia thing very quickly. I mean, we have to remember that the UN is really the sum of its member states.
Yeah.
It is not its own entity. So our missions are only as good as what countries contribute to those missions. And so if they don't bring renewable energy into missions, that's really not the UN's problem. However, the Secretary General would say, absolutely, we need to move away from fossil fuels and use renewables in solutions in all of UN work.
Yeah, as someone who's been in the humanitarian sector, I can tell you that, for example, UNHCR is very seriously looking at, its carbon footprint, how it's, using renewable material, renewable energy, and so forth. Now, we're going to close, but one to each of you. Tell me one thing to inspire everyone that you think is possible, whether in the field of, shaping conversations and pushing for better governance and mitigation or adaptation in this nexus space, or, through your research, how you look at prevention of community conflict, or state conflict in your case, David, on fixing governance. Give us an inspirational 30 seconds intervention. David.
Summit of the Future said very much we need to look at the future of the planet by engaging youth and youth views and a new generation of thinking about what young people expect from their leaders and from their planet. And I truly believe that the success to the SDGs is going to be much, much more dynamic, much more using the new technologies to advance development. And we hope humankind, but I'm quite positive.
Thank you. Tobias.
There's amazing knowledge and agency of local communities out there. There's an increasing realization that we need to listen and blend in and utilize that knowledge. And there's amazing technological change, including renewable energies that could decarbonize things such as UN missions in Somalia. So there's some quite positive trends that we can look forward to despite all the problems the world is currently facing.
I don't like these on the spot kind of questions, Dr. Jamila. You're very good at putting people on the spot. But three things. I think when it comes to disinformation, all of us have a responsibility and the power to challenge disinformation. We really need to keep our eyes and ears open about it and actively challenge fossil fuel disinformation, climate disinformation. We have the power. Yeah. Solidarity, number two, very important. We have to show up. We have to hold the line. We have to get together as a community. And the third thing, because I'm a climate and health campaigner, the health argument, it's not used enough. It's the best argument for action. It brings the issue personal, human. It's not about numbers, as you said, Dr. Jamila. It's not about quantum of carbon dioxide. It's about our lives, our children's lives, our families' life. Let's use the health argument to advance this conversation and our collective fight for justice.
Absolutely. I think every one of us in this room has a responsibility. We all have a voice. Let me end with a very positive story. I was working with the International Red Cross, and we had a project in Kenya in an area called Kitui County next to Garissa. And you know, Garissa is full of Somali refugees, and Kitui County is predominantly a Christian and non-Muslim community. I managed to mobilize some funding from an Islamic institution. It was actually zakat, if you know, it's mandatory alms. But I insisted that it went to a minority Muslim community next door in Kitui County. And what we did was during the dry season, the drought, to restore the wells, but also teach them using forecast-based agriculture what plant to grow. And we grew something completely different compared to what they normally grow, which is corn. Now, as a result, we had a fantastic yield. And through the rehabilitation of the wells and restoration of water, peace actually was built between the two communities, and they could work together, and they would then create health facilities for the children. And the thing I remember most is a farmer looking at me and said, in the past, my children would have to walk 14 kilometers to get water from the river because there's just no water. They were thirsty and we were hungry, but the crocodiles were hungrier. So I think at the end of the day, this is really about human lives. It is about dignity. And I think the more we look at innovative financing, innovative ways of bridge building and using science, using technology, using financial tools, I think we'll get there. And I'm quite hopeful too. I think that humanity has all the resources it needs. What we need now is the political will and our own will as well. So thank you for bringing the youth perspectives, governance, communications. It's been a tremendous, real privilege to moderate this session. I'll hand over to Sarah, and I have to run now because my Grab driver is waiting for me to get to the airport. So thank you very much for your questions as well, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This was a very interesting panel discussion, and I've learned a lot. And, it's very interesting how these dynamics during the conferences develop. Because yesterday, we heard Chris Murray. He said, one of the central challenges ahead is how to maximize health outcomes with increasingly limited resources. And now we had the panel saying that this relationship also works in a reciprocal way. That if you invest in health, if you invest in gender equity, if you invest in climate health, you're actually contributing to avoid these challenges in the first time. So you're also working to bring prosperity, trust, and peace. And what I got from this panel discussion, that this is not just some social spending, it is actually a big investment in contributing to long-lasting peace, something that Professor Wallenstein mentioned from the Lancet Commission report on peaceful societies through health equity and gender equality. Today, because the panel one questions also asked for more practical examples of how do you do this. I'm happy that I have a panel that will actually showcase how do you do this realistically from different levels. And I will invite my three speakers to the stage, and as they come, I will introduce them. So please, Hila Yoon, she's the founder of the Afghan Youth Ambassadors for Peace. She leads grassroots mental health and climate adaptation initiatives in one of the world's most fragile contexts, demonstrating how youth and women drive change even in the toughest conditions. Dr. Firas Abiad, the former Minister of Health of Lebanon, who navigated a poly-crisis of economic challenges, refugee influxes, and climate shocks in Lebanon, and he will offer us a ministerial perspective on health systems under pressure. And Dr. Jamila Al-Raibi from the WHO Country Office of Iraq, who works at the front line of intersecting crisis, conflict, climate stress, and health system. And she brings a practical perspective of how do governance and partnerships and multilateral institutions play out in real-world fragile settings. So she will speak about her experiences from Iraq. Before we begin the panel two, there is a Slido QR, and I would urge you to use it. It will be pulled out quite soon. Not just to ask the panelists a question, but also if you have questions for Professor Wallenstein, who is also online, I would urge you to also pull out that question. If you feel more comfortable to use the microphone, you can also use that when we have the designated Q&A session. So I will kick us off. So thank you for taking the time to come here today and to share the experiences that were much requested for in the panel one. So I will start with you, Firas. So Lebanon's experiences is an example of how these crises intersect, and economic challenges, environmental stress, geopolitical issues. So can you tell us how this climate of currency destabilization, of climate change, and all of that worked in Lebanon, and how did you deal with that in an emergency response capacity, and how did you deal as a former Minister of Health?
Well, thank you, Sarah, and I'd like to thank the organizers for an excellent meeting and also for the invitation. Now, for you, if you don't know about Lebanon, Lebanon is a small country in West Asia on the Mediterranean. The population size is around 3.5 million. And, we are situated in a very flammable region. And when the Syrian crisis in 2011 occurred, we had the influx of around 1.5 million Syrian refugees into Lebanon. And Lebanon quickly became the largest per capita host of refugees in the world. Almost 1 in 3 of our population is a refugee. In 2019, and after a heat wave and fires, there was social unrest that quickly resulted was followed by a very severe financial crisis that resulted in Lebanon losing almost 50% of its GDP and our devaluation of our currency by more than 90%. That was in October. In the end of the year and early 2020, we had the COVID pandemic that was followed in August by the third largest non-nuclear explosion that Lebanon recorded in its port, the port explosion of August 2020. And, all of these crises coalesced into a severe national crisis, but where it affected health most was that it drove a large number of our healthcare workforce out of the country. Almost 30% by WHO numbers of our health practitioners, doctors and nurses left the country. And that really left the health sector or the health system in a very fragile state. Now, later, and that was during my tenure as a minister, we faced two really very critical crises on top of those. The first one was in 2022, a crisis, there was a cholera outbreak. And that cholera outbreak, was the first time Lebanon saw cholera in a period in more than 30 years. It was driven mainly related to scarcity of access to clean water, and also compounded by the presence of a large number of refugees who were not able to access this clean water. They had to reuse the wastewater, and it exacerbated the outbreak. Then in 2024, we had the war that occurred in Lebanon, which was also in the complications of the conflict that were in the region, mainly the Gaza war. And what was very important for the health sector in that particular war, and I think this is something that should be stressed, is that we are seeing new trends in war, not only in Lebanon, but I think in a lot of the wars that are and conflicts that are being reported, which is the weaponization of health. And that is the actually targeting of health institutions and health personnel. And that actually exacerbates the risks that the health sector needs to respond to. Now, during both crises, which were really a very stern test for our health sector, the Lebanese health system was able to respond. We were able to control the cholera outbreak in a very short period of time, around 5 to 6 weeks. For the war that happened in 24, maybe the sternest test was on the day of what's known now as the pagers explosion. This is where more than 3,500 small communication devices exploded at the same time, which resulted in a few seconds we had more than 3,000 casualties, which we had to absorb in our hospitals. Because of all the efforts that were made before for preparation, we were able to absorb them in a period of around 12 hours. All of them were actually in hospitals. 80% required advanced management, including operations, and these were done within 3 days. So, all in all, the situation now for the health sector, that it is still under a lot of pressure. But there are ways by which, even in difficult times, health systems can be resilient. And I think that, this is the message that I want to present to the audience and talk about not all of the bad things, because I think this is something that we keep hearing in all of our conferences. But I wanted to talk about some of the silver linings that would give hope for whether people working in these fragile situations or leading health systems in these difficult times. So for me, I think there are 3 important things that can be a bit counterintuitive, but are important to keep in mind when you are part of such a fragile health system. The first one is the word fragmentation. So we hear a lot about fragmented health systems and fragmentation. And it's indeed, not a good thing to have. But the silver lining of fragmentation is that a lot of the parts in your health system have somehow learned to work autonomously. And in the Lebanese context, especially during the war, where sometimes central communication and central command can become extremely difficult, where you have interruptions, where you have sometimes even the roads can be interrupted. Having that element of autonomy becomes important, and it allows the system to continue to provide services even when other parts of the system are affected. The other word which we also hear a lot is low resource environment. And indeed, I think that when you look at health systems in multi-crisis situations, they tend to be having low resources. But low resources has also a silver lining. The first one is that these systems tend to be a low efficiency system. And that means that if you address the waste within the system, it means that you do have already in the system, without needing help coming from outside, some resources that you can use. And indeed, that was the case in Lebanon, where by addressing the waste, we could mobilize internal resources that allowed us to continue. The other part of a low resource environment is, as they say, the need is the mother of all invention. And a lot of the time, you find that in systems where low resources tend to be innovative and tend to be accepting of innovation. And that occurred in our system, where by adopting a lot of the digitization processes and applications, we were able to control whether waste or graft in, for example, medication shortages, or even allowed us to focus more where our interventions needed to be, for example, during cholera, because of the heat maps that we generated, whether from water scarcity or from vulnerability. The third thing, which is also a silver lining, is that, crises always have within them opportunities. So one of the things that you really need, and we have been discussing in the conference, is alignment and bringing all different parties on the same wavelength. And I think that nothing focuses attention like a crisis, the sense of communal sort of insecurity and the need for collective action. And I think that, when you are dealing in crisis, you see that resistance, whether to change or reforms, like the discussions we were having 2 days ago on the crisis facing the global health governance, and the need for reform. The reason why we're having this discussion now is because of the crisis that, or the shock that the system had to face by the decisions of a year ago. Now, having said that, there are 3 important anchors that without them, all of this effort will not be conducive to good results. The first one, I think, is governance. At the end of the day, bringing everybody on the same line is important, but the direction has to be the right direction. So even if you bring them all together, but take them in the wrong direction, that will not have good outcome, good results. And to me, good governance means accountability, which is something that is extremely important, and that it needs to be people-centric. Really at the heart of the matter, the interest of the people you're serving needs to be there and driving the direction you're working on. And this brings us to the second point, which is about inclusion and coordination. Having been in the hot seat, so to speak, it's very tempting for you to become more authoritarian, to say that we don't have time to have the discussions, to say, we don't have the resources, and therefore take the decision and move on. And indeed, if you follow that approach, you will have momentum. You will generate momentum initially. But the problem is, as the cracks appear, as the problems come up, and they will come up, then all these fissures start surfacing. And then all the efforts that you have made will tend to be dissipated in all the discussions and the blaming that will occur. And therefore, I think that being inclusive from the beginning, making sure that everyone is sitting on the table, and especially the people who are most vulnerable, whether the women, the youth, making sure that they are part of your decision making, having the buy-in, I think will pay dividends as you move forward. And finally, I think something that is also extremely important is adaptability. No plan is perfect. No strategy is perfect. And, in a multi-crisis environment, surprises will always come up. And therefore, you need to be adaptable. But the way to be adaptable is to have a learning mentality, being, making sure that you learn from your mistakes and from the mistakes of the others. Now, this is extremely important because I think that we're all, talk about how there is a major decrease in the funds that are available globally. Understood, but the knowledge that is available does not cost a lot. And I think that there has been multiple efforts. For example, the GLN system by the World Bank, what we heard about the efforts by the Japan on EHC, or meetings like this that allow different perspectives to be shared, I think play a very important role in adaptability. Finally, just a very quick comment. We've heard in this conference a lot about the move from concentrating on national interests and the nations allowed to plot their way as part of accountability to the community. And I fully understand that, and I fully understand how donors sometimes can really have different agendas than the nations themselves. But I think that at the end of the day, if we have learned anything from COVID, and that is health is global, and it cannot be compartmentalized. And therefore, I think that, even with national agendas, we really need to keep in mind that we are in this all together. Thank you.
Thank you, Firas. Thank you. There was really interesting reflections, and I'm really glad that you mentioned, not to confuse leadership with power and privilege, and not to be diluted. You should act upon that when it's not needed. But I'm also glad that you mentioned the responsibility for inclusiveness, especially of young people and other communities that should have a voice which they usually don't have. Which is why I will continue my question to Hila, who is representing these voices. And she works with the Afghan Youth Ambassadors for Peace that focus on community-driven resilience in a context where conflict, climate stress, and gender-based inclusion really intersect. So I would like to hear a little bit from you. How does this work, and what do you do to counter it, and in which way? And if you've been to the previous plenary session, I can say from firsthand that Hila is a very strong and promising voice, and I'm really honored to have her in this panel and to hear from her.
Thank you. I don't know how many of you know about Afghanistan as well, but our country is a landlocked country. We don't have access to water that much. And if you see the news on the ground, in Afghanistan, there's a lot of crisis happening, and climate is not like a key priority at the moment. Most of the time, I remember when I first started working on climate work in Afghanistan, and the word climate change to a lot of people in Afghanistan sounds very Western word. It's like, what is climate change? People are in survival mode. They don't really understand what climate change is, what displacement is, and how them being displaced and is impacting a lot of their livelihood. In Afghanistan, the first time when we started working on climate change and displacement, we encountered many people and many stories we've heard, and we're still working with these victims on the ground. And to build a picture right now in Afghanistan, half of the population, including women, don't have access to school or education or mental health support or any health centers at all. So basically, when displacement happen or anything that is caused by climate change, them having access to healthcare center is nearly impossible. So when we started working in Afghanistan, our main work was how to do localization of any projects on the ground. Means community need to lead these projects in Afghanistan. Because in Afghanistan, we have struggled with a lot of donors reaching to certain parts of the country, which creates a barrier to a lot of people in the country, and they don't have access to it. And the first thing we did at the local level in Afghanistan was how we can involve faith and climate together. We started working with religious leaders on the ground in Afghanistan because they have access to mosque. And every time there was internally displaced community arriving from one village to another village, we asked the imams on the ground on how to make sure we don't have any conflict between these two communities, because they were victims of floods and droughts in the country. And we kind of tap into that element. And oftentimes when we talk about climate, the interfaith lenses is missing most of the time in a lot of these communities. So our approach was how to work with faith leaders and promote climate resilience and also peace-building dialogues through a faith-based lenses in the community. We started planting more trees. We tell the community, because the Prophet said that planting trees is good for environment. So very basic conversation we started with this. We asked the imams that, can you please give refuge to these community who became displaced in your mosque? And the community, the villagers, started bringing food and clothes and a lot of things to the community. But I also want to touch on one point, that when climate disaster happens in countries like Afghanistan, how it is impacting women and young people. We had cases in Afghanistan where people were selling their daughters for $100 because of climate disaster, because they didn't have any money. This was very normalized. And we had meeting with a lot of UN members as well, with different NGOs. We cannot have with the current de facto government, unfortunately. But when we're talking about a lot of these agencies, sometimes I did attend some certain climate events outside Afghanistan. For example, in Paris, there's a lot of things happen. And it's very dystopian situation, because when you come from countries like Afghanistan and then you attend these fancy conferences abroad, where the main focus is that, yes, we have recyclable bottles, and this is our biggest achievement. And they showcase that a lot, but a lot of time when you're bringing speakers from conflict-affected countries, there's this famous quote by a Palestinian author, Muhammad al-Khurd. He wrote a book called The Perfect Victim, and I recommend everyone to read that oftentimes the oppressed and those who are victims, they need to be cool-headed, they need to be forgiving, and they need to represent themselves in a way that no matter how much their life is falling apart, you need to represent yourself as a perfect victim. And that's how most of the time the donor community and the international community respond to climate disaster in conflict-affected countries. The reason why I said that, because in Afghanistan, most of the time, any climate intervention is very reactive. Flood happens, okay, we're here to support. Earthquake happens, okay, we're here on the spot to support you. Basic dignity kits, food is on arrival. We don't have any preventive measures in countries like us to actually make sure we are ready in advance to tackle this type of climate crisis in Afghanistan. And countries like Afghanistan as well, I'm just giving you the example of my country here. But oftentimes when these preventive measure doesn't exist, we have more casualties. Like recently in Afghanistan, we had many earthquakes, like thousands of people died. And we were delivering food packages. I remember one of our members, he was sitting with one of the family members. The person lost 7 family members in one night, like his kids, his wife, his mother, and his father. So now imagine sitting with this person, and here I am delivering food packages to you. What is missing is the mental health and the grief this person is processing. This is not available on the ground right now because the priorities is different. Donor community don't have any resources. How many grieving families you're gonna reach out? There's a lot, because back-to-back earthquake happens, and this person was completely numb. He was just sitting there, no matter how much we were speaking to them, there was no response, because losing 7 members in one night because of climate disasters, this is what the reality is mostly on the ground. Now, we don't really talk about the recovery process of this. Yes, we deliver response packages, we deliver tents and water and stuff, and then that's it, the program ends. There is no delivery, post-delivery or post-recovery process happening in Afghanistan. Then this leads to something else that we don't really mention oftentimes when climate disaster. It's called political grief. And these people join violent extremist groups later on because they lack resources, they don't have anything. And we were working on preventing violent extremism one time in Afghanistan. And there's so many interlinkages that most of the time when we talk about climate and policies and these things are missing from conflict-affected countries, and we don't really mention it. So I think my point and lesson learned from where I come from is preventive measures should be the key in the country and the context that I'm coming from. But also you need to design with women and youth, not for women and youth. It's really important that you include them in the design process, but also tab onto the faith leaders and the community leaders and the tribal leaders. And localization is the key for any implementation of preventing climate disaster in the community. So that would be my lesson learned and recommendation moving forward. I think knowing more about different contexts is really important. Sometimes for us, because we have so many crises happening in my country, sometimes climate change or these topics are overshadowed, but it's really important to know what's happening because it does have a ripple effect on the regional countries as well. And it's really important that we are updated about and learn the stories of how many people are impacted. Thank you.
Thank you, Hila, for this sobering speech and for us to think about, our daily activities and also how do we approach those that live daily through the experiences that you just described, and how mental health is important and how reconciliation is important for the lives of those that are living in these circumstances. Jamila, you work with organizations such as HELA's, you work with governments. You are now the representative of WHO in Iraq. So can you tell us a little bit how does multilateralism and partnerships, how can they be leveraged in policy dialogue from your experience, and how practically do you work and what do you see?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for PMAC for this opportunity to join such a wonderful panel. If you allow me, I have a presentation I would like to go through with a short video at the end. If you allow me, I'll go just through some data around and information around Iraq. Iraq is a 46 million population, and it is mostly a youth population. Mostly 70% live in urban, and also there was a rapid population growth, and the number of the household is big in relation to some of the countries. Also, Iraq suffered of 4 decades of conflict. There was a lot of discussion now in transitioning from humanitarian to development for the last 2 years, but unfortunately struggling to have this transition because of the security situations. There was a prolonged sanction, and this is, we will imagine how it impacts the economy, impact development, and also including the health sector. Also deterioration of the regional conflict, it's really affecting Iraq, especially with the movement of and mobility. We had refugees from Syria, but also now there is a lot of discussion about moving more from west Syria to Kurdistan, Iraq. Also, there is the risk profile shows many complex multi-hazard environment from high to very high risks, mainly communicable disease and environment. And Iraq hosts around 10 to 12 mass gathering. And one of them is I think the largest in the world. Last year, we had 21 million coming to Iraq for the pilgrim. And we can see just how is this burden on the environment or also in the services that would be provided. Also, the displacement due to fragility and environment is still going on. For the climate stressor, mainly extreme heat, drought, water scarcity, and dust storm, this compound to communicable disease, and it is unfortunate also that Iraq is suffering from the cholera, from Congo-Crimean hemorrhagic fever. Every year we have mortality from that, and we know how the environmental changes and climate change is affecting those. Also, there is a rising heat and the heat strokes, and I'll give you more information about the data and how it's affect also the non-communicable disease, especially the respiratory. Also, there is a disruption during the extreme heat of the supply chain and the surveillance for the communicable diseases, and also the displacement. A lot of displacement happened from the south and also from the rural area to the urban. So the impact of the climate changes, and especially with the extreme heat and the in Iraq during the summer, certain areas and in Iraq the temperature will exceed 50 degrees centigrade. And we just imagine how this disruption of the life of any work happening in those areas, and it's for a long time during the summer time. Also, because of that, there is evaporation of the river, and the water flow for the river flow is declined. The rain also fall reduced. And this will make more salt in the water coming from the sea. And this is, you will see in the movie, how this affects the lively stock of the people, because this is the only available source. Also, there is a dust storm. In Iraq in 1990, there was around 25 days per year with the dust storm. In 2022, they reached 200 days per year. Just imagine how this is increasing. And we need to go just beyond numbers. What does that mean if we have 200 days per year with a dust storm on impact on the people's life every day and on their health? Also, because of these condition of the climate changes, this is affecting the agriculture and also affect raising of some of the cases of malnutrition because of the accessibility and food security. In numbers, and I think for Iraq, and to see the impact of this in the health. For example, with the water scarcity, will affect the quality of water. And it is unfortunate that a couple of years, just 2 years back, there was an incidence of watery diarrhea outbreak in Basra, which reached 118 hospital admission. And we see how is the burden on the health system from the climate change. And I think this is an evidence for people who are ignoring that the health has a relation or impacted by the climate change. Also, there is raised cases of asthma during the dust storm. Also, mental health, because the movement of the population, and also access to the lively stock, to the agriculture. This is really, there is increased cases of anxiety and depression. Also, the extreme health affect the mortality, and some of the documented, heat stroke happening in Basra last year. It's just not far, but last year there was some documentation of cases. Also, as I talked about the Congo-Crimean hemorrhagic fever, couldn't get rid of it, because of the lively stock movement, and also because of the accessibility to water for these livestock. Also malnutrition, as we said, due to access to food and food insecurity. What has been done, and I can say not a lot in this area, because it's still prioritizing health, prioritizing climate change and impact on health, considering health sector can be as a mitigation for the environment and climate change. Still, we need to do a lot in that. And this is where we did a health dialogue with the leaders and decision makers within the health and outside the health to link and to coordinate. Also engaging influencer, and especially beyond the health sector and other ministries, faith-based organization. And now we are thinking about the political parties, how to engage the political parties in health and in climate change, and how they can be an advocate for that. Of course, we can't forget the community, and especially the youth and their engagement. So during, and this is with the multilateral engagement with the IOM and also UNDRR, with the Multi-Migration Trust Fund, which is more than 20 donors. But this is really gives us that we are together, we can work. And there are some action. First, we were focusing on how to integrate health and to be health very strongly in the country adaptation plan. And beside that, we did also the adaptation plan subnational for the areas where the environmental health is really an issue in certain areas. Community-based adaptation and social cohesion, we need to hear from the communities and youth. It was youth-led CAP studies and also dialogue among the community with also campaign about the WASH and the RCCE, which is the risk communication and community engagement. Also, the fragility and insecurity. And this is the data was very helpful in generating those data to talk to the decision maker. Youth engagement and as an agent for climate peace. And here I think presenting them in every, conferences and to have their voice is very important and they can lead some of these activities. I know the challenges are very huge, but I'll talk about opportunities because we have already heard a lot of challenges. The opportunities, we have evidence-based policies developed based on the data for Iraq. Also initiative targeted such as the Global Health for Peace initiative, partnership and how we can strengthen the health governance within the adaptation plans, also health diplomacy and health dialogues, and youth as an agent for climate adaptation. We should to continue on that. I'll leave you with a short video to show you a young person with disability, how is the life is going, just to think about what we are talking about, either challenges or opportunities or even numbers. This doesn't reflect what those people are suffering from. So Bridget, if the movie or the short video can be shown. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. So, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions from the audience, because I feel that there's a lot of wisdom in the other side of the room. So please bear with us for a few more minutes, please. Okay. If, as I said, if you're more comfortable to use the microphone, please do so. There are also questions on the Slido, as I saw. So if you can just, yes. Yes, Rudy? We'll take your question first.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Rudy Konings from formerly World Health Organization. The World Health Organization has this Global Health and Peace Initiative that it launched not so long ago. So my question to Jamila is, how does that influence your thinking and the concepts in this Global Health and Peace Initiative? How do you use them in practice in your work? And does it move things forward?
Thank you. If you allow me, Sarah, yeah. Thank you, Rodi. This is very important. And I think this was the global initiative for, for health and peace was a request from member states. And it has the resolution endorsed in 2024. And the champion for this resolution was Oman and Switzerland. And it has really initiative to tell where are the areas where we can work in promoting peace for health and health for peace. I can tell you the truth, it didn't go in a larger scale with the resources to the countries. But as a WHO, we try to really promote the peace through our work. And we have quite good examples. For example, for polio in Afghanistan or in Gaza, the last crisis we had. And the polio campaign was so difficult to do it in the first or second year in Gaza. And there was really a lot of dialogue with the with the both sides, how to promote the vaccination campaign for children. And this is led by WHO. In Somalia, the mental health for youth have been affected by conflict. In Iraq, we used it for the retainee from the Al-Hol camp. These are families and mostly women and children coming back from a camp for 7 years. They haven't seen even anything outside it. They don't have say on their destiny on that. When they came back, they went to the community and they were not accepted in some of the communities. So we tried through the NGOs and young people that they are working with them, how to promote health of women and children through this. So there is a smaller scale in countries going on, but I believe that we need to take it at a larger scale with resource mobilization and more stronger partnership.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Yes, please.
Great, thank you very much. I came in late, I heard the last part of your presentation, but I'm really struck by this presentation on Iraq. This is not a space I'm familiar with. But it seems to me that what you described is not something specific to Iraq. It's a larger regional. It must be happening on other borders as well. So I'm wondering to what extent that there is a transboundary bordered dialogue or coordinated effort to deal with these issues, particularly around the issues of water scarcity. And then the second would be population migration. You make reference to displaced population, but there must be a fairly fluid movement of people trying to access more livable conditions, not just within Iraq, but again, regional. How is this all being addressed? Thank you. And really nicely presented.
Thank you. Well, for the first question, Iraq is among the 5 countries globally hardly affected by climate change. And I believe this is not in isolation, but there are countries around. And I think the dialogue between countries is very important, especially in water scarcity. And we know that this is a political issue, And I can tell you the truth, also the Iraqi are not happy about this discussion is not taking place. And I found it really an opportunity for partners and for international community to support that dialogue, because it will solve a lot of problems. And I think this is not unique to Iraq or surrounding countries, but we find it in different areas of the world about fighting over resources. And what we see lastly, even about the act, how can we take resources of others? This is where we come back to the international law and how this regulation can be helpful. For the displacement, there is no, there are some work to mitigate the actions or to prevent, and sometimes is availability of water for some communities not to leave. But this was not enough to make that population, and especially in the marshland, where they depend on water and their livestock. And you can see really the displacement because of that. And there is a burden of the systems, of the services, where they will go. And unfortunately, there is no really support services for those who have moved from their places. But this is a discussion unfortunately, is an equity in the resources, also distribution of resources among the subnational level. That's why in our work, we have involved the local authority. Thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Can I take just 2 questions from Slido, and I will aim these to Firas. That's okay, I'll combine them. Which preventive systems do you use, and how do you engage youth to build these systems? But really short, because we're at the end of the session.
I'll give it, to answer that question, you have to think about it from a politician's point of view. So the average tenure of a minister in my part of the world is around a year and a half. And that means that the attention is really focused on the now and not on building a system that will take 4 to 5 years. And therefore, most of the time you're fighting fires because this is what you are accountable for at the end, rather than building a system that will require the tenure of 2, 3, 4 ministers. And that's why, in my opinion, one of the major issues that I have faced during my tenure is that the way the international community works with the local authorities, in my opinion, is broken. The system is broken because they tend to work in silos. The local authorities sometimes focus more on the now, and the international community comes and say, okay, let's see if we can, if they want to move out a bit from the humanitarian part to see how can we develop something, a system for 3, 4, or 5 years that will take 3 or 4 years. Now, the problem with working in silos is there is no sustainability. Once, for whatever reason, like what happened last year, there is a sudden decrease in ODAs, there is interruption in a lot of those systems. So the quick answer is we need to find a new way of working where it is a partnership where both sides have skin in the game and are putting something on the table. In my opinion, that is the best way to address things such as prevention or working, before the problem happens, rather than reacting when the actual crisis occurs.
Thank you. Since we're out of time, I would ask you to engage with the panelists after the session. I'll just close the session with 2 sentences, which I took from both panels. And that is that since the sessions were about planetary health and peace, means that planetary health risks do not automatically lead to violence. They become destabilizing when combined with inequality, exclusion, and fragile institutions. And if we invest to try to mitigate this is not just a moral imperative, it is a strategic investment in peace. And peace is not built only after the crisis ends. It is built beforehand if you have governance choices, if you are smart about your priorities, and if you're inclusive. And because I I was an academic not so long ago, and I'll take this privilege to say this, that the challenge ahead is not the lack of evidence. It is the political courage to act upon what we already know, and we know a lot. Thank you for being in this session. Thank you to the organizers, to the panel, to all of you that came, and also to the staff that helped us to organize this session smoothly. Thank you for coming.